Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Biosecurity Talk, the new frontier for biosecurity. My name is Charles Fracchia. I'm the CEO of BioBright.
And I'm Nathan Case, the Director of Incident Response for National Resilience.
So I wanted to start the talk with a sort of situation report on the vaccination situation today in the United States, because it'll show how important digital biosecurity is to our nation's and indeed the world's well-being. Today, we stand at 49.1% fully vaccinated, a little over 188 million people in the United States with both doses or fully vaccinated with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And about 56.8, almost 57% of the adult population in the United States vaccinated with one dose or more. Now, the problem is, you see here on the left, is actually a map of vaccine hesitancy in the country. And as you can see, it is peaking and it is going to cause major issues.
Now, we need to point out that most people wouldn't tie what we're seeing here to digital security, but as we look at this, the whole point of this talk is where do those two things cross? And as we look at what we're seeing here, we're going to try to talk about exactly what we're seeing. This is a combination of those two issues in one place.
When you look at the vaccine hesitancy grouped around the country, and you can get data from the CDC website, which I did a few days ago, you can see that actually hesitancy can reach pretty high numbers, especially in states like Montana, Wyoming, Alaska, Arkansas, etc. And these are major issues that will plague us, especially coming in the fall and in the winter, which is pretty clear.
Now, in many cases, a lot of people would say this is a political issue. And what we're trying to get across here is that it has no real basis in politics. This is actually a health and safety issue that we need to discuss as citizens and, frankly, as humans.
And the reason biotech is really, really important is that in this pandemic, 1 in 100-year pandemic, really we see technology, biological technology, really coming to the fore and showing how important it is for our daily lives. If we go back and look at when the CDC notified HHS, Health and Human Services, and National Security Council that there was a pandemic starting or there was a pandemic potential starting in China, we see that on January 3rd, and we get EUA emergency use authorization from the FDA for the BioNTech vaccine December 11th, 2020. That's 344 days. We get the Moderna vaccine a few days later at 351 days, and the Janssen vaccine at 422 days after the first notification. These are astounding numbers on the biological side. In the past, we've seen vaccine development reaching, almost a decade, but certainly well into 5+ years. So the fact that we are under a year for an emergency use authorization of a safe and efficacious vaccine with the numbers that we see is really tremendous. And this kind of technology is absolutely essential for our survival as a species, frankly. But there's a new threat. And this is what we're here to talk about, is at the intersection of cybersecurity and bio, we have a whole new landscape, which COVID-19 has really brought to the fore.
Well, not really, sort of. We'll
Right.
see about that in a second.
Exactly. How much has COVID-19 actually brought this to the fore? It's quite astounding. This is just a small selection of news headlines. And again, this is the public information that's out there about attacks. We've seen nation states, we've seen cyber gangs, we've seen basically everyone really piling on to this capability and trying to attack both vaccine manufacturers, the supply chain, everything under the sun.
Now, why would they do that?
Yeah, the goal here is both intellectual property theft, but we've also seen attempts to disrupt and actually destroy the supply chain, which is a real issue.
And as we get into what a hacker would want, or why a hacker would do something, or why a hacker would specifically attack a vaccine company, there are questions around moral and ethics, I suppose. But the reality here is, when people do this, when hackers attack vaccine companies, you're dealing with far more than that. We're going to get into that further. But the other thing to look at here is that this really isn't a new threat. And to be fair, it's not even a unique threat. It's a threat that's been around for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, when you start looking at the landscape, what Nate is saying is 100% right. When you look at the landscape of biology today, it's entirely digital, and it has been for a little while. We have systems like automated, here in the top left, automated biomanufacturing and scale-up capabilities. We have complex HPLCs. We have complex automation and robots doing sample picking and dilution series, etc. We have barcode systems are fundamentally hardware, software, and firmware
all in one thing.
All in one thing, actually collecting the data. And then, of course, all of this information is going into your electronic lab notebook, electronic medical records. And unfortunately, none of these systems were ever designed with security in mind.
In some cases, they weren't even designed for logs.
That's right. So this is why we're here today. The change is needed today. And we represent a cross-section of sort of biology and cybersecurity expertise, and we're here to try to open your eyes and really provide a few guiding principles to help bring this field into the 21st century and into secure practices.
All right, so security is a cultural imperative. When we talk about the way that security works and we talk about the things that we as humans need to do, we need to think about the ways that we think. We need to think about the ways we approach the things around us. So questions that come up like, we've always done this before, why would we change? Quality is security, right? My safety person deals with that. Note the question mark on that one. My security person said we are safe. We are, right? Well, so here's the thing. In many cases, as we look at security, we need to be very cognizant of the fact that security is a journey. It's not a point. It's not something that you achieve and then hold on to. It's a point in time. So something could be secure one day and then not the next. So when we talk about things like quality and we talk about the way quality impacts security, that's great. Quality is really important, and quality goes into a lot of things that come into vaccine manufacturing and biomanufacturing. Absolutely, but we need to focus on the fact that that's a subset of security in general, and the reality is that it's a form of compliance. So as we look at what is quality and what is security and how does that culture change, we really need to take a step back and kind of begin to examine a lot of things that we've accepted as fact and as normal, because a lot of those things really haven't been what we expected them to be.
And this is something that Nate and I hear a lot. But this is the best in class for our field. I think it's safe to say that we need to move away from this thinking. Just because it is best in class today, it just isn't appropriate anymore. And we need to move past it.
If your vendors look at you and say, well, no, you can't have the logs, or no, you can't see how we do incident response, or no, you can't see how we even do security detections, you need to take a step back. And even though it may be best in class for your field, maybe it's not best in class for you. And maybe we need to take a look at that so that the vendors get the idea that, hey, maybe we need to change. At some point, we all have to stand up and say, you know what, this is our responsibility. And that cultural imperative is kind of what we're talking about.
So let me talk to you for a second about what happens when even best in class doesn't cut it, right? Obviously, this is an example that many of you are probably familiar with, and if you're not, this is probably going to be an eye-opener. But in 2017, Merck was actually hit by NotPetya. It was not even a direct attack by all accounts. It obviously was targeting something else, but Merck got hit like many other companies. What did it lead to? Well, Merck had to borrow about $240 million worth of Gardasil, an HPV vaccine, from the strategic national stockpile in the United States in order to actually cover the lack of doses. Not only that, but a year or two later, when the insurance claim actually came through, Merck actually made a claim for a little over $1 billion in losses. Let that sink in for a second. $1 billion of losses from an attack that didn't even target them, in all accounts.
So this is generally in the cybersecurity industry what we consider a near miss, or something that would be potentially secondary. It's not something that legitimately was aimed at them. So if we look at a $1 billion loss at an accidental hit, we have to assume that an actual hit would have been far worse.
So this is how we feel. That's how we feel when we hear the sentence, right? Is we really need to get out of that burning room. We need to start grabbing extinguishers, and that's what we're here to talk about, right? Extinguishers and strategies to actually put out the fire.
That's really good. We're in a place where we can do that. So the cool thing is that there's a lot of new technologies that have come out in the last 20 years that allow for basically the cyber industry or the digital industry to kind of help with some of the bio industry and the biomanufacturing. We're going to call them opportunities in security today. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We go from observability, redefining quality, understanding risk, supply chain insecurity, and disinformation as a threat multiplier.
We're going to go through these in the next few slides.
So let's be honest. This is kind of the reality of the situation for most of us. In the IT industry, in the cloud, you name it, I've seen the InfoSec grief 5 stages routinely. This is what happens when someone realizes that there's actually a threat, an existential threat potentially against their company or what they're dealing with, or potentially that they've been attacked. So, about 2 years ago, Andrew Krug and I gave a talk on observability and threat detection. So you can't do anything with a threat unless you know that it exists. And the reality is that observability is that first thing. We have to understand that there's a threat to be able to correct it. So obviously the first thing we need is logs. We have to have, as cybersecurity people, as biomanufacturing security people, we have to have logs. We have to have a way to see the things that are happening. And that means pretty much becoming a lumberjack. It's one of those things where we have to love the logs that we have. We have to get into the fact that these logs are pretty much the way that we're going to evaluate the things that we buy, the things that we use, whether that be software or hardware. And that means that all of our vendors have to get on board and give us those logs and allow us to see what's happening, whether that's off-the-shelf software, whether that's biomanufacturing hardware that you buy, you name it, we have to have those logs. And once we have the logs, we have to be able to alert off those logs. So if something's happening, if Charles has decided to hack my laptop, I want to know that Charles is hacking my laptop. So I need the logs to figure that out. But not only that, I want it to go ahead and call my cell phone or hit me in Slack and tell me, hey, Charles is hacking my laptop. Now, the reality is that my laptop is kind of worthless, other than doing this presentation. I really don't have many valuables there. So one of the things that comes up is, well, why would you do this? Is there anything useful there? And there's a lot of different ways to mitigate that issue. We can go ahead and use SaaS services. We can use a lot of things to take those valuables and move them elsewhere or protect them specifically. So let's be honest, we can't do everything at once. Cost is key here in many ways. We have to figure out what's going to be done first, and that's great. But we also have to figure out what the cost of the things that we're going to protect is and what the cost of losing is. And in some cases, some of it's not money, especially in this industry.
Yeah, so I think this is really key. For all of the biologists sort of in the audience, or biomanufacturing folks, or even chemistry, any sort of form of biological industrial process, this is really essential. You need to go through your entire process and understand how you can observe. How would you have ground truth information for something that occurred on your systems? They could be laboratory systems, they could be manufacturing systems, but it's absolutely essential. Unfortunately, today, when we go into laboratories and other systems, we essentially are going in blind. There is no background, there's no historical logs, there's no logs of any kind often. And on top of that, adversaries will actually target those and delete them. So having a history of those is really, really important to determine how to recover. So at Merck, again, the same example, remember, the worm was actually based on a ransomware. And this is a really important piece that you'll see in a second, because it helps us understand what kinds of risks exist out there in the industry.
So we need to understand the risk in digital biosecurity. First of all, I've had a lot of people that I work with and a lot of people that I've talked to, friends, families, all of that stuff. We don't really run on computers, we run on paper. Okay, well, prove it to me. Well, we've all got, here's the paper, here's my batch records. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and send you an email. The reality is that in many cases, even though many of the biomanufacturing folks in the world feel like they're a paper system or feel like they have a paper system, the reality is they're a tech company. And as much as they don't really want to be a tech company, they are. So we need to start looking at the fact that a lot of us are tied hopelessly to O365, SharePoint, Excel, you name it. And those things are actually the things that are running our businesses in some cases. It's not just a matter of, hey, we've got paper records and worst case scenario, NotPetya hits you and no big deal, we'll just rebuild the system. Well, that's maybe true, but the reality is what we're seeing in this example is that that's not accurate. And as much as you feel that way, you need to start tabletopping this stuff. And if you don't know what tabletopping is, come find me at DEF CON and I'll happily walk through it with you. And we will do a cute little tabletop with you while we wait, and we'll show you that a lot of things that you think are probably paper probably aren't. So it's time to embrace the tech.
Yeah, let me really footstomp that last point, because we've seen this in biomanufacturing environments a lot. It's like, oh, we run on paper. But in reality, that paper is printed from an application, from actually a software product that collects the data from the back end, from the SCADA systems or the industrial control systems. And unfortunately, you have to start thinking about how those could be modified, how those could be actually creating problems for you downstream. So you print something that you think is true, is ground truth, but it actually isn't. Just because you have a paper backup doesn't mean that it truly is a paper process. You have to think about the threats there. And this leads us to, again, the Merck and Co. example from 2017. The big kicker is that the reason it caused such a large loss in value and strategic problems with the Gardasil supply is that it actually touched the manufacturing process. It actually impacted the manufacturing process. That's a big deal for many of you if you're in pharmaceutical companies. You have to think about the interconnection between your corporate networks, what Nate was talking about, sort of all of the O365 applications, and how you're actually working in the manufacturing process. Just because you're working in the manufacturing side doesn't mean that you're actually maintaining an account on O365 or SharePoint, and the malware can actually come in that way. So you have to think about where things originated. And this is where it leads us to our third point, which is the biological supply chain insecurity.
So we talk a lot about supply chain insecurity or supply chain security in general right now because it's really interesting. And to be fair, I can't even count the number of companies about people or jobs or things that they want to do with supply chain security. At previous jobs, working in and with people focused on supply chain security, it was really interesting. And as an incident responder, I got to work on a couple of the largest ones on the planet. And it was really interesting from I'm going to call it an intellectual point of view, but as a hacker, it was interesting to look at it and see exactly how someone had injected one thing in a code base and then watched it progress through the code base and finish in the app. So as we start talking about things that are combined with biosecurity and biomanufacturing, it's not necessarily just code anymore. Suddenly we get into some really funky stuff about what can we inject into the things that you're going to buy from someone else. And how is that supply chain going to be validated and secured?
Yeah, so we have to think about this digital biosecurity, which is what we call it. It is this hybrid field where cyber threats can actually inform the biological side. What happens if something were to adulterate or mess with, for example, the supply of bags, of single-use bags for manufacturing? These are real problems that we have to grapple as an industry. And they're the complex problems. They're the analogs that, if you're familiar with the cyber world, are sort of, this is where the Stuxnet type threat lies. These are not the sort of cheap and cheerful, fast and dirty type of attacks. They are really the long-standing, the ones that can actually bankrupt your company.
All right. So this worm was based on a ransomware. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, ransomware is one of those things that can be kind of overused. A lot of people like to think that ransomware is something that is special or it's an ingenious type of an attack, and it's really not. And so as we look at the way that we define quality in digital, ransomware is something that really is dealing with something at an enterprise security level, but it begins to approach something in quality pretty quickly. Because as we try to redefine quality inside of digital security or inside of enterprise security, we have to be very aware of something like a ransomware. So ransomware is kind of messed up. What is ransomware? Well, ransomware is the ability, and we've talked about this a little bit, but I want to make sure you understand what it is. Ransomware is the ability to take something that is information, that is a batch record potentially, and encrypt it so that now that I've taken Charles's batch record, he doesn't have it anymore. All right, so I, the hacker, now hold on to Charles's batch record. Now Charles is going to pay me because that's the ransom, and I'm going to give him his batch record back. Right? Am I?
The key problem here is, how do I know that the batch record is the same that was before?
And maybe I don't. But here's the thing. Right now we're seeing a massive uptick in ransomware. So here's the other thing that really gets into this. As we start deconstructing what happens in a ransomware attack, okay, if you were an attacker and you were getting good information from someone, if you were exfiltrating that information and walking away with it, would you ransom their files? If I told you that the mean time to detection right now for most of the companies in the world was more than 100 days, what does ransomware actually mean in this case? Chances are ransomware is the last thing that's going to happen to you. So if I'm if I'm ransoming back to you your batch records, chances are I've already got copies of them. And maybe you don't anymore.
Yeah, this is a real issue, and this is something that we are seeing in the field a lot, because ransomware is becoming easy to use. It's becoming basically a service, and there's a real interest in the biological space, from vaccine manufacturing all the way down to other fields of biology, such as agriculture, livestock, etc. So don't think that just because you see this in the news, this doesn't affect your field. It does, and it does today. Okay, the last 2 points that we want to make here is you have to think about disinformation as an actual channel of attack. In biology, it's a bit different from consumer tech or other environments where the product that you produce can either be thrown away or has little impact, or can be actually kept separate from people's lives and survival. That's not the case with bio, and in particular with vaccine manufacturing. What happens if an attacker, like they did in December late last year, actually obtains information from the European Medicines Agency and then releases it a month later, completely adulterated, in order to change public opinion?
Can you prove that?
That's the difficulty. That's exactly the perniciousness with disinformation, and it has real effects. We opened this talk by giving you vaccine hesitancy numbers and vaccination rates in the United States, but this is true around the world. We know that there is a public campaign, there's a broad campaign to actually disinform the public about the effectiveness and safety of these vaccines. If you operate in the space, you have to think about the combination of these attacks, not just attacks in the cyberspace, but also at the opinion level with disinformation.
Qualifying risks in bio. So let's be honest, qualifying risks is qualifying risks. This is the same exercise that you will do in college if you are going into security as it is right now. It is what it is. We're going to qualify the things in our labs, in our manufacturing facilities, and decide exactly where do we sit in the risk level, right? We want to understand what that is. Risk equals impact times likelihood, and that's great, but what happens when our tools have no passwords? What happens when we can't have any sort of a malware protection in some of our software programs? What happens when our vendors don't bother to patch for current vulnerabilities, or frankly can't because of financial implications? When we talk about deployment pipelines, we're talking about things that generally would happen in a CI/CD pipeline, and I get it. for most biomanufacturing folks, that's kind of out there and the next thing. But the reality is we're all moving that way. So whether you're there now or you're going to be there in 5 years, the protection of that pipeline is frankly key to the continued existence of your company.
And when it comes to the actors implicated in here, unfortunately, and this is all public record, the whole gamut of actors are extremely active in this space. It goes from nation states who are interested in winning geopolitical points against their opponents, but also cyber gangs that are actually financially motivated. This is an extremely lucrative market, and in fact a very juicy target because of our historical bad position or lack of attention to cybersecurity. Unfortunately, our historical position in that space has been so bad that it is our opinion that even individual hackers actually can make quite a bit of damage in this space. And we need to rapidly move away from that environment. It needs to be difficult for individual hackers or even low-skilled hackers to come in and mess up an entire nation's sort of manufacturing supply of vaccines or other life-saving drugs.
Now, obviously, time is limited. I would love to have thousands of hours in a day to be able to do all sorts of crazy stuff. The reality is I don't. And the reality is that neither do you. So we need to start looking at life just like we do in quality, where it's a risk-based approach, right? We need to understand the risks associated with the things that we're protecting or the things that we're trying to do and evaluate, should I go ahead and fix this or that other thing? Now, I said it a second ago, risk equals impact times likelihood. So impact, how bad is this? Well, we have kind of a skewed scenario here because how bad is this is pretty bad in some of these cases. Likelihood, well, if I don't have passwords, likelihood is pretty high. So some of these numbers are going to look kind of scary to begin with, but the goal here isn't to deal with the fact that they're scary numbers. The goal is to be honest with yourself and make those numbers go down over time. So when we talk about this, we want to make sure we ask ourselves some basic questions. We want to talk about how bad would it be if this happened? Like, if I lose my batch records, how bad would it be, Charles?
Yeah, it'd be pretty bad.
Okay. So what is connected to this piece? Well, when I say piece, I mean like lab equipment, or do I mean something along the lines of, hey, this piece of manufacturing equipment? Well, you know what? If it's not connected to the network, that's great. If it is connected to the network, I need to evaluate how that's connected and what it's connected to. And if I say that something's air-gapped, I need to evaluate that it is indeed separated from every other device on the network. So I can't say that something's air-gapped if it's also plugged into other corporate networks, okay? So that's what we're talking about when we ask if this piece is connected or not. When we talk about other things that are around this piece, well, it sounds kind of wonky, but realistically, near-field communication is a real thing, and we have to think about that sometimes. Would other partners or customers be impacted by this loss? So you know what? Sometimes it's not about you. Sometimes you are the supply chain. Sometimes you are the supply chain that will hit someone else. So if we talk about your stuff, your software, your product, how would people be affected if this were hit? And this is where, if you look back at some of the other talks I've done, we talk about thinking like a criminal, being devious. And being devious is an excellent thing to be, as long as you use it for good. So please use it for good. As we talk about likelihood, I mean, obviously monetary events are great. Everybody likes making money. But the reality is a lot of the things we're talking about in bio have nothing to do with money from the attacker's point of view. And it's important for people to understand that. Again, ransomware is the last thing that happens. It's not the first thing that happens. It's not the only thing that's happened. If I get all of this stuff, what do I get? Do I figure out another way to make a vaccine, or do I get to do something inappropriate with your political image?
So what do? We spend the last 30 minutes talking to you about a lot of issues that exist in our field. But we want to leave you with sort of positive thinking and what are the things that we can actually implement today to actually move forward rapidly. All right. So here are 4 things that you can really do to improve the stature and the standing that you're at right now in your company today so you can protect yourself. The first and most important thing is you need to do a fiscal review of your situation and the risk that your company is actually under. The second is you need to understand all of the product engineering changes that either you or your vendors will need to go through in order to improve your risk tolerance.
Now, regulatory change is an interesting one because that's not really necessarily you, but it is kind of you. And the last one is share info, which we'll also call community. So as we look at this, we want to go ahead and figure out how we can change the world around us and how we can change that world with each other.
So let's talk about the fiscal risk review. You need to do this now, okay? No two ways about it. You need to kick off a program to do this now. Go and assess the cost to your company or facility if it were to go down for 3+ months. That should be your starting point. Don't assume that these numbers are wrong. Go and quantify for 3+ months. This is based on knowledge and views that we've seen across the industry. It is not an unreasonable amount of time to actually be impacted from this. If anything, it's on the low end of the amount of time. How many projects can you actually afford to lose for your company? If you supply a service or a material or something, if you are the supply chain, how many of those customers can you afford to lose before you go bankrupt?
Now, in the incident response world, we call this mean time to detection. So it's cool if you figure it out right away. And let's pretend that you have a batch running and all of a sudden you realize that something bad has happened. Well, certainly you'd call someone like me and you'd call someone like Charles and we'd come in and we'd help you. The reality, however, is probably you haven't figured that out for a couple of weeks, if not a couple of months. So as we get into this, you have to be aware that your ability to detect a failure is really the number we're using for 3 months here. So if your ability to detect a failure is about 100 days, you think probably, that's about what you ought to go after. But understand this mean time to detection is really the key. Have you conducted an audit of your development lifecycle? Probably you have. I'm hoping, please. This is something that we all have to do. So the development lifecycle is the most important thing that your developers and frankly anything in your product portion of your company can do. And we have to understand and have a really good governance policy around things like securing software and frankly the CI/CD pipelines and the other things that are key to the things that we create. So if you're a SaaS provider, you desperately need to provide your customers logs. You desperately need to show them by hash, and if you, again, don't know what that means, come find me at DEF CON and I'll happily talk about it, but you need to find the hash value of the artifacts that they're using so that they can validate that what they're using is actually what you made. Because some of the things that a hacker will do is to go ahead and give someone something that isn't what they expected.
Yeah, this is really important in our space because in our field, unfortunately, we often talk about 21 CFR Part 11 compliance and integrity and GXP, good manufacturing, good laboratory practice, etc. Regulatory terms that have actually been very useful for the field historically, but today we need to really update them. Don't trust just because a tool, software or hardware or a vendor tells you that they are compliant with one of these. Don't assume that it actually is up to snuff for today's problems. Chances are it isn't. And so this is very much a case of you have to verify and not just trust. So on the regulatory change aspect, the first point I really want to make extremely clear is that today, despite the fact that we are, a year and a half into a pandemic, the bioeconomy is not currently declared critical infrastructure in the United States. That needs to change tomorrow. The reality is that without the bioeconomy, Nate and I couldn't be sitting next to each other without masks. And we're both vaccinated. The second thing is that we really need to change the definition of quality so that it includes security, and security in a wider sense of the word. Not just workflow integrity, but actual integrity of the data and integrity and security of the entire system, so that we know that the systems that we are using to produce a drug are actually operating as they should be.
Correct. So a lot of things that come in here when we look at changing regulatory thought, we talk a lot about, well, there's a lot of regulatory talk about the fact that creating your own software, for instance, is really hard to do, and that's the most risky thing you can do. But the reality is, if you follow modern development practices, and that can be hard, and yeah, you're going to have to learn how to do that probably, it can actually be one of the safest things you can do, because then you can actually mandate and govern the things that go into that software. So as we look at how to do this, it's really kind of flipping a lot of things on its head and understanding that security is encompassing a lot of things. Part of that is compliance and quality. And we would love to help. We want to get involved, and we want to be your friends, and we want to show you how we do it in other industries so that we can do it here and make this safe.
Yeah. All right, so you want to cap us off?
Sure. So let's build a community. In the tech world, we have open source, and it's a big deal, and we work together to produce some frankly amazing stuff. I've worked with some crazy people and done crazy things, contributing to Prowler and doing a bunch of other open source stuff. Worked with Andrew Krug for years doing different things with incident response tools and working with Mozilla. And frankly, there's also something called nomoreransom.org, which is a great thing that we all do together. So as we talk about building a community, we should...
we should actually gather as a community. And this is where the BioISAC, which is actually being announced at DEF CON this year, the Bioeconomy focused Information Sharing and Analysis Center. This is a nonprofit that we created that is meant to gather people so that we can share threat information and we can actually show the bad guys a bad day. Right, so that we can actually maintain the security and the integrity of our systems.
So this is a good way to help out the world around you. And one of the things at DEF CON that I've always loved is the community that is here. So as we talk about things that we need to do together, regardless of where you are, regardless of who you are, we need to protect each other because there are only so many humans in the universe. And realistically, this is kind of a threat to all of us. So let's work together.
Yep. So we hope that you enjoyed the talk. Actually, I'm going to stop there. Oh, God, this is a bad idea, wasn't it?
That was a bad idea.
No. It's probably still recording.
We should turn it in with this at the end.
I'll just trim that, yeah. I was going to say we should add just one slide that says thank you, and then we can just cap it off.
Yeah.
That's a pretty nice sunset, actually.
No complaining. It's still recording, but it's not listening.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the talk. I know that Nate and I had an awesome time. Thanks again. Please reach out to us online. We're eager to meet you and discuss this. Let's go out and do this together.
And hey, if you're interested in coming and fighting this fight with us, helping us save the world, we'd love to have you. So definitely, I will be at DEF CON in person, which, it is what it is. I'm really excited to be there. It's kind of fun to be out of the house. Find us. Find me. Looking to hire lots of people. So if you're into security and you're at DEF CON, come find us.
Thank you.